In the British city of Bath, there is a bath. It's not just a clever name. It's not just any old bath. It is the Bath, or more accurately, the baths. Baths that soothed people's aching limbs and sloshed around their most intimate areas 2,000 years ago. They are the Roman baths of Bath. Roman Emperor Claudius and his legions came over here back in AD 43, and when they made their way to the small ancient British settlement at what we now call Bath, they would have been astounded to see, in this rainy and cold bit of a rainy, cold island, a wonderfully warm natural spring bubbling out of the ground. The Britons already revered this site as sacred. Legend has it that King Bladud, one of the maybe existed ancient kings of Britain, founded the settlement next to the springs that were said to have healed it. The legend goes he had leprosy, he went in the water, and his leprosy was washed away. The water that bubbles up through the earth at Bath percolates down from the nearby Mendip Hills. It collects through limestone underground and is then heated and forced up through the Earth's surface by geothermal pressure, coming out at nearly 50 degrees centigrade, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. That's just planet Earth there, being awesome. And when the Romans saw this, they went bananas. They turned the spring into an enclosed set of pools. They used lead-lined pipes to channel the springs and a temperature system to get different baths at different warmths. They even put in underfloor heating, which I don't even have in my house. That's pretty amazing, really.
All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us?
The baths lasted until the Romans naffed off when their empire went to bits in the 5th century. Time and soil eventually consumed them. The modern city of Bath grew up on top. A major excavation to get the Roman baths out only began in the 18th century. Now, you can go and visit the Roman baths today, which I strongly recommend if you like spending a lot of money to look at a wet hole in the ground that used to have Roman willies in it. But what you can't do is swim in it, because swimming in it is not allowed.
The rivers of Babylon.
In 1978, a young girl was swimming in the waters of the Bow Street swimming pool in Bath. It was a Victorian-era pool. It was near to the Roman baths, and it drew its source of water from the same place, the Mendips, the underground, the spring that bubbled up. The name of the young girl isn't in the public record, but what we do know is that not long after she took her dip in Bow Street baths, she got ill. Very ill, and she quickly died. She died from an exceptionally rare, very nasty meningitis-like infection. Let me see if I can say this in one take. Primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. How about that? The cause of that was a tiny water-based little bastard called Naegleria fowleri. It was an amoeba that lived in the Bow Street baths. It got up the poor girl's nose, from there into her brain, and it killed her, as it almost always does. Unsurprisingly, the Bow Street baths were closed and never reopened, and swimming in the Roman baths nearby, remember, gets its water from the same source, was permanently banned as well. Lest there be any lingering doubt, you do not want to get Naegleria fowleri up your nose. Its street name is the brain-eating amoeba. That is literally what it does. The brain-eating amoeba lives in untreated water, like ponds or badly maintained swimming pools. And importantly, the water must be warm. The warmer, the better. The brain-eating amoeba wiggles its way up your hooter, goes into your brain and does what it says on the tin. It eats your brain. It makes you profoundly ill very quickly and you cark it. Now, before you start screaming and running off into the night, please don't worry. There's been fewer than 500 reported cases of primary amoebic meningoencephalitis resulting from exposure to Naegleria fowleri in the last 60 years. The good news is you are very, very unlikely to get this brain-eating amoeba up your nose. The bad news, well, there's no easy way to say this. Climate change is very good news for a brain-eating amoeba. As this episode's guest on Your Brain on Climate, Clayton Aldern, says in his astounding book, a snippet of which is read here by the wonderful Ruth Everett.
It is rare, but it kills with ruthless efficiency. It is becoming less rare. To live, Naegleria fowleri requires a bath of at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it grows well at temperatures up to 115 degrees. As waters warm globally, more Naegleria fowleri are waking up.
Now, Clayton isn't saying this stuff to bum you out. A reminder, it's vanishingly rare you're going to get one of these up your nose, climate change or not. You've got more chance, I've got my calculator out to work this out, of being killed by a bolt of lightning. He's saying it to make a couple of wider points about how we think, or should think, about climate change. Point number one is the heart and soul of the episode. I'll come to that in a bit. His other point is that, well, brain-eating amoeba in the water is not a good thing, and it's the kind of thing that focuses attention and gets people to notice and care about stuff in a way that climate change, abstract, fuzzy climate change, sometimes fails to do.
You just can't get people excited about something amorphous like climate change, but I don't know, I can see brain-eating amoeba being a somewhat pressing political priority if indeed, as projections suggest, there are going to be more and more brain-eating amoebae jumping into people's noses. I would argue that instead of framing the kind of shipping of climate policy out to the world as a climate solution, we ought to be thinking about the shipping of climate policy out into the world as a neurological health effort. But isn't it funny that those policies happen to be the ones that are really, really beneficial for brain health, right? They're the policies that are going to help us ward off the next dementia epidemic. They're the policies that are going to ensure we're not being exposed to neurotoxins in our environment. They're the policies that are going to ensure that the probability of encountering a brain-eating amoeba remains extremely low, right?
Clayton's other point, his main point really, and the gist of this chat is this. More brain-eating amoeba because of climate change is a pretty direct way to understand something profound, which we all too often forget. Your brain ain't separate from the natural world. You're not. We are an indivisible part of that world. And so a changing climate, which changes the weather and the life of everything that relies on that weather, will change us too. Like us, physically us, not our economies, our power structures, our culture, not just those things, but physically us, the meat and the potatoes of you, a human. Now, this show is called Your Brain on Climate, but maybe I need to change its name for this episode, because Your Brain on Climate implies a kind of detachment, a temporary state. But actually, your brain ain't passively sitting back and observing climate from a distance. Your brain is not on climate. What Clayton is saying, your brain is climate, whether it's got a nasty amoeba in it or not.
Your brain on climate.
I'm Dave, and welcome to this episode of Your Brain on Climate, the show about human brains versus the climate crisis, or perhaps this time around, the climate crisis versus human brains. Before we get going, a reminder, this podcast is all made by me. I'm a humble indie podcaster in a great big sea of big capitalist podcasters. So if you like what I do and you want me to keep on doing it, please do go and chuck a couple of quid a month over to patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate. And if you can't do that, or you won't do that, that's fine. But a 5-star review and a written endorsement at your podcast medium of choice would go a really long way. And remember, before we get started, if you hear this noise, it denotes wisdom. It means that somebody, usually my guest, has said something you might want to read more about. And if you check out the show notes, there'll be a link to more information. Right, on with it. As you've already heard, joining me on this episode of Your Brain on Climate is the quite remarkable writer, to give him his full name, Clayton Aldern. I was hanging out in the British Library, as I do, and I was browsing its splendid bookshop when I came across a book about climate change I'd never seen before. This was a book called The Weight of Nature by this guy called Clayton Aldern. It had the tantalising subtitle of How a Changing Climate Changes Our Minds, Brains and Bodies. Bang on my turf, I thought, and I purchased it forthwith. I read a lot of books for this show, and I know that some of you buy a lot of books as a result of this show. I say this without reservation. The Weight of Nature by Clayton Aldern is probably the most extraordinary book about how to think about climate change and how to understand its relationship to us that I have ever read. Here's Clayton to introduce himself.
Credentialed approach to this thing, right? I work as a journalist. I lead the data team at an environmental magazine called Grist, which is the largest environmental magazine in the States. We're a nonprofit. We cover environmental justice and climate solutions. And from the perspective of an environmental journalist, naturally, this mode of approaching the question of our times appealed to me. But the genesis of this idea is from a former life. I used to work as a neuroscientist. It's what I went to grad school for. And, something on the order of 10 years ago, somebody put in front of me a copy of a report from the Pentagon that basically said, there's this undeniable relationship between climate and conflict, right? You can kind of correct for all of the mediating sociodemographic variables under the sun. The Pentagon, right, the Department of Defense, still considered in 2014 climate change to be a threat multiplier, right, that acted on social aspects of our relations. And so as a neuroscientist, right, at the time, I had some kind of alarm bells go off wherein I said, okay, listen, if these people are saying as much, and you also heard the argument around that period from 2013 to 2015 or so arise around the Syrian civil war, right? That this was to be considered a climate conflict. And a report came out of Stanford that year that said, hey, climate and conflict are indeed inseparable in some fashion, insofar as, and this is the argument that's quite similar to the Department of Defense, you can of course see all the manners in which something like drought may lead somebody like a farmer into dire straits. And those dire straits, economic or otherwise, might be associated with the likelihood of violence. And also, these economists at Stanford, that's who they were. They were environmental economists led by a guy named Marshall Burke. You could acknowledge these economic forcing factors and you could correct for them. And there was still some kind of, let's call it, psychological or biophysical or something, right? There was still some kind of effect that showed a marginal relationship between temperature and aggression, right? Between climate and conflict at the interpersonal level, at the intrapersonal level, right? So there's this relationship between heat and suicide, and indeed at the level of the neighborhood or the county, or indeed in the case of something like geopolitical tensions between countries. And so again, and we don't want to kind of over anthropomorphize something as complex as, for example, the Syrian civil war. Yet when we have the DoD and some Stanford economists kind of ringing these bells, say there's something going on here. In the lab that I was working in, I became somewhat attuned to the questions that people were asking about these relationships. And ultimately, the long story short of the past decade for me was kind of leaving formal neuroscience, kind of in the interest of pursuing some of these lines of questions in a slightly more public forum. And for me, that forum has been environmental journalism. So it's a story of kind of coming to the evidence and seeking to conduct some of my own investigations into these questions while presenting them for broader consumption as opposed to publishing in academic journals per se. I mean, the book is called The Weight of Nature because I conceptualize climate change as this weight on our shoulders, and it as a force that indeed moves us. It forces our hands. Right? We can think about this in a couple ways. For example, climate change, through its effects on heat, and through its cause of increasing atmospheric CO2, through its effect of something like particulate matter released through wildfires, it acts on human cognitive abilities, right? It acts on impulsivity, it acts on cognition and aggression and the degree to which we consider ourselves to be critical thinkers, right? One could argue that those are interventions in our free will, right? In our conceptions of agency. It does more than that, right? As climate change changes temperature patterns and rainfall patterns, we're seeing the spread of brain disease vectors like ticks and mosquitoes, and rabid bats expand their habitable ranges, and that means higher incidences and prevalences of brain diseases like cerebral malaria and neuroborreliosis and yellow fever, right? All that we've spoken a couple times on this call about neurotoxins and about brain-eating amoebae, right? These are the kinds of things that we're going to encounter more and more as a function of a changing climate. And we haven't even touched the psychological dimension thereof in terms of the mental health effects of a changing climate, right? If you experience climate trauma, you're likely to walk away with symptomology that's reflective of post-traumatic stress disorder. To say nothing of this leviathan of climate anxiety, right, that is weighing on a large chunk of the population. I'm bringing up all these ideas merely to suggest that climate change is not this thing that's happening in the future or in a different place, right? This weight is weighing on us now. It is forcing our hand today. It is infecting our brain today, and that to me is quite pressing. And I would argue, if we're interested in moving toward a livable future, we ought to be paying closer attention to these embodied, internalized neurological, cognitive, behavioral, emotional effects of a changing environment and work to address those because it turns out the same tools that we can use to address those health effects are also the tools that will help us alleviate the climate crisis.
Awesome. Yeah, I didn't know you had been a neuroscientist. What perspective did that give you, apart from knowing how the brain works, on how the brain works? What do you think you know about sort of how people think about climate change and stuff like that other people don't know?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, at the time, George Marshall's book, which is called Don't Even Think About It, had come out recently. And this was kind of the Renaissance object that said, well, of course, psychologically, people are tuned to ignore the climate insofar as it provides something of a background to our experience, right? Climate change is this slow-moving, pervasive thing. It crosses borders, it crosses generations. Psychologically, that's not really how we experience the world, right? We experience the world as a function of social relationships and in the here and now, as opposed to thinking about future effects, right? We're really bad at forecasting as a species. And so Marshall's claim, among many others, was basically that we're not particularly well wired to process, much less confront, the question of climate change. Marshall's not a neuroscientist, but he got a lot of stuff psychologically right in that book. And I think what the past few years of research and maybe some nascent understandings at the time have illustrated for me is that I think neurologically speaking, right, biophysically speaking, at the level of what it is that the brain does functionally, right, mechanistically, there are further reasons why we are not particularly well equipped to process what's happening, and this really comes from a tradition of computational neuroscience. Right, I was a what we'd call a computational or a theoretical neuroscientist, where I'm not actually working with real animals or anything like that. Right, I'm modeling networks of the brain in a computer. And in the tradition of computational neuroscience, inevitably we try to describe what's happening with math. And one of the greatest theoreticians of our time is this guy named Karl Friston, who has a theory of the brain that stems from this idea of his called the free energy principle. And briefly, what the free energy principle states is that the point of nervous systems, right, of which the brain is one feature, but broadly speaking, across all species, the point of nervous systems is to basically instantiate a model of the world, right? It as an entity, as a physiological construct, it instantiates this generative model of the environment in which it is embedded. And what modeling the world allows a nervous system to do, and in the case of conscious organisms that have conscious access to this model to do, is basically understand what that organism ought to expect when it navigates the world. Now,
what should I eat? What should I fight with? What if I fall off this thing? Is it going to hurt me? That kind of thing.
Right. And also, like, what's boring and what's interesting, right? Like, I'm not shocked every time I look up at the sky and see that it's blue, because I've come to expect the fact that it's blue. Now, in the case of something like a wildfire, when it turns orange, I'm like, whoa, there's something going on there. I should pay attention to that, right? So the fact that nervous systems calibrate our expectations about the world should point us in the direction of looking at something like climate change from the perspective of expectation. Now, what is climate change doing? It's basically rewriting all of our expectations about the environment. It is injecting a ton of uncertainty into the system. It's kind of moving the definition of normal in a couple of directions at once, right? So temperatures are increasing, atmospheric CO2 is increasing. We know that sea levels are rising, but all this stuff is kind of creeping along, punctuated with like really high levels of kind of dramatic uncertainty. That's a really hard thing to model, much less for an organism that is already bad at kind of predicting the future. And so as an organism that has conscious access to a model of the environment, we're in a really tricky position now, which is basically you have this system within you that's constantly trying to calibrate a definition of what it means for something to be normal. And of course, given the slow creep of climate change, that definition is changing. And at the same time, you have this brain kind of whispering to you like, well, no, this is the thing we need to adapt to. This is the world in which we found ourselves. Let's make sure we can navigate it appropriately. And that can be a little bit dangerous, because if all of a sudden we understand our changed world as a normal world, we're not going to want to respond to anything, right? We're not going to want to make a change.
We're not. Like here in the UK, like I know you guys in the States have had sort of some pretty ferocious weather, right? Here in the UK, in stinky London, where I am, we have had last summer, 5 separate like heat wave episodes. Heat waves being in like UK money, that's like 30 degrees centigrade. I don't know what you call that. It's high, right? 5 separate ones of them. When I was a kid, you never had them. I grew up in London, right? You never had them. If you had them, you made like one a year and it would be extraordinary. 5 separate ones. And I work on climate. This stuff freaks me out. Even I'm like, well, that's just what it's like now. I'm not freaked out about it. A few years ago, I was like, oh God, I saw the weather coming. It's like, this is coming. It's going to be awful. Now I'm just like, well, that's what happens, you know? So really quickly, we are adapting to it.
Right. And the problem that's known as shifting baseline syndrome would suggest, for example, that your children, I don't know if you have children, but the next generation will experience, let's call it 10 heat waves every summer, and they're going to consider that to be normal, right? If your grandparents experienced 10 heat waves in the summer, they would be freaking out. They would know that something is alarmingly wrong with the kind of local meteorological environment and would probably want to marshal some resources to figure out how to change what's happening. But because we've only ever been alive as long as we've been alive, right, the experience of normal for the next generation, right, the generation that comes after us, is going to look at this world, and the only hope that they have at recognizing what they're experiencing as abnormal is to refer to the historical record, right, is to refer to the scientific evidence base. But their experience, right, the psychological experience of being in the world and witnessing 10 heat waves per summer, that's going to constitute their expectation of what it means to be alive in the 21st century.
Global temperatures in 2025 were slightly lower than 2024, but that still makes it the third hottest year on record across the globe. A study by the Met Office and European climate scientists also found it was the third year in a row in which temperatures reached more than 1.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels.
Which I guess is it's both a problem, but also weirdly not a problem, right? So it's a problem in a sense that means we'll never act with the urgency that this sort of boiling soup requires us to act with, at least in that analysis. I guess in a weird way, it's like it's a good thing because it means we will just adapt to it. Like we won't be living in a state of permanent fear about the thing that has just happened.
Right. And of course, that is the end goal of the expectation setting in question, right? We want to remain adaptable as a species. But you know, where I push back there is, of course, physiologically speaking, we can only adapt to so much. You know, yes, it's true that as the world heats up as a function of something like evolution, maybe we'll grow more sweat glands and we'll be able to process, biophysically speaking, higher and higher wet bulb temperatures. Also, people have done this modeling, right? Like we basically can't grow enough sweat glands fast enough to keep up with the pace of temperature change. So while it's true that we can adapt away some of what we are likely to experience under a changing climate, we probably can't adapt to all of it, purely because of the pace of evolution, the pace of technological change, right? The pace at which we as humans tend to marshal biophysical and social relations in order to adapt. Those types of changes probably can't keep pace.
Now, there was a while there, wasn't there, for like a couple of years when it felt like the world was really getting its shit together on climate change, politically. I mean, like it wasn't all brilliant, not enough at all was being done. But politicians, including American ones, took climate change seriously. Not only did they think it's an actual problem, but they thought it should be a priority. But I'm recording this in early 2026, when now, in the States, you've got a president who says,
"We will drill, baby, drill."
And here in the UK, the party that is ahead in the polls says,
"We make no difference whatsoever. I think we should be mining our own coal that we need for our steelworks. I think we should be self-sufficient, in fact, even an exporter of
if
gas.
the climate warms, so be it."
And it seems like for all the progress that is undoubtedly being made, politics is taking one step forward and at least one step back. Now, I don't want to come over all gloomy about this, and I know the best way to make sense of whether 21st century global politics was good enough on climate change is not in the heat of it. But it doesn't feel too clever right now, that's for sure. And it got me wondering, will it ever? Do you think that climate change is ever going to be a thing that is like the number one thing that humanity cares about, more than healthcare, more than economics, more than wars? Is it just by its nature always going to be a thing that we have to kind of force attention on because we'll always get used to it when it's happening to us?
Not sure. I toss this question around here and there, and my answer tends to change. And I think where I'm sitting now, listen, first of all, if I could have written this book without ever using the phrase climate change, I would have, because the point of the book is less about climate change per se and more about just what it means to be an organism embedded in a dynamic environment, right? Environments change, organisms change in kind. That's the point of the book. Climate change is this lens through which we can kind of focus the discussion. It really throws a lot of these effects into sharp relief, right? and through the lens of climate change, we can witness these effects occurring at a pretty high rate. That said, I think, at least in the United States, which is the context that I'm most capable of speaking to, the notion of climate change as a priority is probably never going to be met politically as, the number one thing that folks want to work on until, God forbid, everything comes crashing down, right? You've got like 50 hurricanes happening at once, right? Really kind of post-apocalyptic stuff. Yeah, then maybe I can see some kind of communications effort ramp up that says, hey, everything's on fire. Maybe we should do something about it.
Maybe things aren't all right, guys. Maybe things are bad.
Right. Barring that, barring the kind of necessary attuning of one's political conscience to the material circumstances that are embodied by something like a hurricane crashing into your life, there's, to me, a corollary question that says, can climate change ever reach the position of a top political priority without exposure to climate violence? And the reason I mention that I would have loved to have written this book without using the phrase is because I think so much of the political conversation is about phraseology. And I don't have an answer in terms of a prescriptive solution here, but I do wonder if, as opposed to thinking about the issue as this broad, amorphous, uncertainty-inducing, complex, right, what Tim Morton would call a hyperobject, this thing that's really hard to wrap our heads around, why would we try to make this thing that's really hard to wrap our heads around like a political slogan, like a priority? Like that, it's just, we're not well suited to it. So I wonder if there are means of breaking the issue down to some constituent parts, and those parts arising to the level of political prioritization. And it's a speculative claim. And again, I don't really have a prescription here, but I do wonder if there's a means of communication, particularly with respect to political communication, that would somehow think through the implications of this hyperobject and then target some kind of political machinery in the direction of the implications in question, right? The individual effects thereof, and maybe this is kind of the sneaky, Trojan horsing of climate change into the political account. But I do think that there's a somewhat useful potential reframe here that says, I'm just interested in public health. I'm just interested in prolonging the lifespan. I'm interested in ensuring that people don't die of preventable diseases. I'm interested in ensuring that the status quo represents something other than a given acceptable level of infant mortality. There are just other means of cultivating human flourishing. And I think that we could advocate for those means purely as a function of thinking through their implications for public health.
Your brain on climate.
Welcome back to Your Brain on Climate. I'm Dave, and in this episode I'm talking to the neuroscientist turned environmental journo and author Clayton Aldern about his book, The Weight of Nature. As I said, I think it's quite simply the most beautifully written, profound and mind-stretching book about what it means to be alive in the first place in a dynamic and volatile and changing Earth. It's got brain-melting amoeba in it and stuff like that, but all in illustration of a much deeper point. And that is, well, I'll let Clayton tell you because he's much cleverer than I am. Conversation so far that will make you completely rethink the way you think about this. One of the things you say in your book quite early on, and I've been saying this to everyone, honestly, since you said it in your book, and they go, shut up, that's not true, is climate change is not a thing. Climate change doesn't actually exist in the world. Weather exists, you say. Climate change does not. Discuss.
The climate, period, is a social construct. And this is readily observable by noting the definition of the climate, which is to say, I mean, even by the World Meteorological Association, climate is average weather. What is an average? Average is a human idea, right? It's you have to average over something. You have to average over space and time. And those are arbitrary decisions, right? And in the case of something like climate change, we're suggesting that one 30-year period of a certain, let's call it 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer chunk of space looks slightly different as measured by arbitrarily chosen metrics, rainfall patterns, temperature differentials, whatever, in some chunk of time relative to this other chunk of time. I just said a lot of really arbitrary stuff. And that is not to suggest that we don't experience the very real impact of these changing meteorological conditions that are well described by the various metrics we chose and the arbitrary constraints we imposed upon them. However, it is to suggest that the climate and changes in the climate are useful rhetorical and psychological crutches for understanding our physicalized, embodied experience in the world, right? We invented the notion of climate because, again, it is this thing that allows us to wrap our heads around the world in which we found ourselves. The climate is a thing, and I won't even say that it sets our expectations. The climate is an embodiment of our expectations, right? To be able to write down something like rainfall patterns and temperature patterns over seasons in space, what does that do for us? Well, that's us writing down what we expect normal to be. And we spent, the beginning of this conversation talking about the point of nervous systems being to model the world, right? To set our expectations about what we think we're going to experience. The climate is an embodiment of those expectations. The climate is us just writing that stuff down. So when we talk about whether or not something exists, I mean, there's a very large conversation to be had here at the kind of existential level,
let's get French about it.
And the phenomenological level as to whether or not thought. Right, Descartes would say doubt is the only thing I cannot doubt. Right, thought is the only real thing. So sure, maybe this expectation is real in that sense, but I don't think we need to go there right now. The point is that while I can hold my hand out and rain will hit it, as you suggest. Weather is real. Rain is real. The description of average weather that is embodied by the notion of climate is merely that. It is a description. It is an expectation. And so we're already, as soon as we use that word climate, we're already talking about a psychological construct that is an embodiment of expectation, and that we, as individuals charged with modeling the environment, refer to in order to set our internalized representations, expectations of the world around us. And that sounds a little less real to me, and when we talk about what's real, what's not real, it's part of our model of the world, but I can't really grab onto it.
It's part of our model of the world, and the world is made up of biases. I mean, there's again some stuff in your book, but my cat's model of the world is not the same as my model of the world, right? My cat doesn't need to know about podcasts and computers and classical music and banging her head on the door. She doesn't need to worry about those things. She does need to understand about mice and high frequencies and where to have a crap in the woods, right? She doesn't need to know that stuff. And so the human experience is made up of just the things that are useful to us, right?
Yes, and this is again a function of evolution, right? This is what it means to navigate one's eco niche, right? We model what is relevant to our phenomenological experience. We model what we are capable of leveraging. This is a function of the psychologist Gibson, right, who described the notion of affordances, right? Affordances are features of the world that allow us to do something. Right. And when we encounter a coffee cup, right, this thing affords me the ability to grab it. So I'm indeed going to do so. It affords me the ability to put liquid in it. This is the function of the thing, embodied by the affordances it allows me. Our entire modeling effort in terms of navigating our environments is predicated on understanding the affordances around us. So indeed, we model the stuff that is relevant to our survival. We model the stuff that is relevant to our being able to navigate this dynamic environment. And so we model something like weather. We model something like weather patterns, because imagine in the agricultural revolution an inability to have a sense of what constitutes, a normal seasonal evolution of weather patterns. You'd be planting stuff at the wrong time. You'd be frightened every time, rain started to fall. You'd have no idea what was going on or how to organize a farm. But by understanding what is likely to happen next, given your past experience, being able to write that down and instantiate this model of the world in the form of this idea that's known as climate, well, now you know that when May rolls around, it's time to, plant peas. And so that is relevant to your survival. So indeed, you undergo that modeling exercise. But it's not really relevant, as you suggest, to your cat's survival, because, you've got your cat on an automatic feeder. So they don't really need to think about the seasons per se. So indeed, this is part of the somewhat damning experience of being in the human body, being in any organism as a conscious or semi-conscious individual. You only ever have access to a model of your eco-niche. That is what you have been crafted to do. You've been crafted through evolution to model not just the environment, but the parts of the environment that are relevant to you, the parts of the environment that actually afford, right, in terms of Gibson affordances, that afford an ability to act on that environment.
All of that chat was making me think about a thing I read in the British Library, funnily enough, by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, a 1974 essay you may have come across called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? In it, Nagel concludes we will never know what it is like to be a bat. We can model the bat's brain in a computer, we can pick apart all the bits of the bat's brain, and we can conclude that we think we know how sonar works, but we'll never actually know what it is like to be a bat, to be in the mind-body environment thing of a bat. Any more than I'm really going to know what it's like to be Maggie the cat, who's staring at me right now. Hello, Maggie. Even though I, too, know what it's like to always be very, very, very hungry. This is the crux of Clayton's book, really. Not only are we indelibly part of the world and affected by everything in it, including changes to nature, but what climate change really is, from the subjective mental experience, is changing our uniquely human model of the world, the model of what it is like to be us, that only we have. The mental model that we form from chucking ideas out into the world and seeing what comes back and forming things accordingly from our senses and how we interpret them. The mental model that says, okay, I reckon that the world works like this. If I push that, that falls over. So I don't need to worry about that anymore. I can concentrate on new stuff over here. Well, climate is changing all that, because some of the stuff we thought the world worked like, it doesn't anymore. And it's changing our brain physically, like through heat and stress and violence and nose bugs in the swimming pool. But it's changing our idea about what normal is. It's changing how we make sense of the world in the first place.
And this is why, I would argue climate change is one of the thorny questions of our time, because as it injects this kind of fresh amnesia into the system that says the world has always felt this way, and as something like shifting baseline syndrome encourages us to reset the definition of normal every 30 years or so, we become kind of further and further detached from the historical record. And I would argue that one of the great things that we could do as conscious beings, right? Consciousness writ large is kind of rare in the universe, all things considered. One of the great things that we could do as conscious beings that have evolved language, and with language developed an ability to express a historical record, is refer to that historical record, because this is actually an outgrowth of our brains, right? This is an outgrowth of our minds. The ability to take that embodied experience and write it down, right? This, if we think about the notion of embodied cognition, for example, a philosopher like Andy Clark would say, as soon as you write, well, I don't know if he would exactly say this, but one of his arguments might be, as soon as you write something down in a notebook, that notebook is effectively part of your brain. Because if you don't have to remember somebody's phone number and that phone number is sitting on a page, you've freed up maybe some resources for something else, but you haven't lost the information and you can readily retrieve it. It's not encoded as a memory, but it's encoded in this different manner on this page. Now that piece of paper is effectively part of your neural network. We can consider the entire historical record to be part of this grand experiment in elevated consciousness, right? We can understand the empirical scientific record that describes climatic change to effectively be this like great, unbelievable feature of evolution that says, well, we went from, just particles that exist to, pseudo cells that aren't quite alive but are maybe navigating the world in an active manner, and then you've got living things, and then you've got conscious things, and here we are. And we've actually evolved beyond that. We're not just conscious, we've extended our consciousness by writing it down, and we can refer to one another, and we can refer to past beings, and yet we're not doing anything with that information. And that's the thorny part to me, the fact that we have evolved to reach this level of kind of evolutionary enlightenment, wherein we can actually speak to the normalizing function of the brain. We can say, listen, I know that it feels normal, but look at what past self told me. Turns out that it's actually not. That should be a gift, right? The historical record and the scientific record should be a gift. And yet we're not doing as much as we could with it. That's kind of the difficult pill for me to swallow.
I'm Dave, and this is Your Brain on Climate. I'm getting towards the end of my chat with Clayton Aldern about climate change and your brain and how they're intimately linked, how climate affects your brain, and how human brains define even what climate change is in a uniquely human way. As you can probably tell, Clayton's book really spoke to me. To me, climate change is a symptom of something bigger, of how we live on the earth. And that in turn is a symptom of how we think about ourselves and our relationship to all other life. We live as if we are separate from the planet. God knows I do enough of the time. Like economics, right? A discipline I worked in for many years, where the mainstream term for things like oil spills and climate change and the death of species is an externality. They call it an externality. Buggering up the planet is external to economics, apparently. External to that system of human exchange. External to what humans do. There is us, and then there is the planet outside us. And I find that unspeakably arrogant and sad. That way of thinking about what it is to be alive. I hate it. And I think that's what's always under it all kind of got me out of bed in the morning, because it gets to me sometimes, all this. The gap between what our lives on Earth really are, the beauty of it, how preciously, delicately dependent on everything else we are, and the gap between that and the story that we too often tell ourselves, that we are superior, clever, indestructible, destined for life on other planets, rather than protecting this one. Yeah, it gets to me. People have always said to me, like, kind of, why do you do the work that you do? Like, why do you bang on about climate change and do all this sort of communication psychology stuff? Why do you do it? And I don't think, and for a lot of people that I know, it's kind of a fairly narrow thing. They're like, they want to get emissions down right? They want like climate change not to happen or something. But it's never really been that for me. Important though that is, don't get me wrong. It is about something closer to what you said about kind of humanity understanding that it is part of, like an irreducible, intimate part of the only place in the universe that we can live, and without which we wouldn't be here in the first place, right? So you describe it as like we're part of a human dynamic system. And I kind of feel like the only evolutionary, if not an end game, like the kind of point of all of this hoo-ha, all of this developing phones and stuff, if it doesn't allow us to do that, then I kind of think we're buggered. So I wanted to thank you kind of for that description. But what chance do you think of politics and institutions getting their head around that basic idea that we're not like these sort of enlightenment imaginations of humans as separate from nature, that we are just intimately part of it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would kind of put the same probability of success on that front as the probability of moving past something like capitalism, which maybe is a somewhat low probability right now, maybe an increasing probability in the medium term. The reason I think those probabilities are somewhat similar is because I think the solution is probably somewhat similar, right? Something like capitalism is that which encourages this individualized view of the self, right? This kind of walled off, separate self that pulls oneself up by its bootstraps and, through the kind of anarchy of the market, manages to forge a path to glory. This Western individualized and a pseudo-autonomous capitalistic self, I think, runs quite counter to our naturalistic understandings of the world that look quite different, empirically speaking, right? That look different when we try to understand what it means to be a self in this world. And arguably, and now we're really, getting into the kind of relevant underlying ontologies. Arguably there is no such thing as the self. Arguably, like, the self is an illusion. We, again, are conscious beings enmeshed in a body, which is enmeshed in an environment. There's kind of no meaningful material separation between those things. We can speak of statistical separations, and we can speak of inference being performed across a boundary that differentiates a given entity from its environment. But this is all one, this is one big statistical bath.
This thing that we call a self then is just part of this model. This what I had Professor Anil Seth on. I don't know if you come across his work a few years ago, and he talks about how like all of life as we experience it is what he calls a controlled hallucination. Right?
Exactly.
So we're basically the brain is kind of just giving you some fake information, but enough to get you through your day. And the self, it could be argued, is just part of that.
Right. It is a product of consciousness. It is a product of having access to your model. If you're capable of modeling your own model of the world, you are conscious. And I would argue that that self kind of ships with that. But it's just a different feature of the model. You're still involved in the game of trying to understand the environment in which you have been enmeshed. Now, all that said, is capitalism likely to end? Is climate change likely to be solved? Is the self likely to be deconstructed from its individualized instantiation and maybe reborn as a non-dualist, more embodied, enlightened instantiation? I said it's a low probability.
The answer to this better be yes.
Yeah. I said it's a low probability, but I also think that it's likely to happen through a variety of means that probably don't look anything like that which we are currently pursuing. When we were speaking about kind of smuggling in the Trojan horse, Trojan horsing in the climate policy soldiers. I suppose, one way to think about what that would look like in practice, we're speaking about the kind of public health angle here. One way to think about what that would look like in practice is to, kind of just turn the equation around and say a lot of time people are advocating for something like climate policies because of as you suggested, there are benefits for emissions, right? And maybe there are even co-benefits for like, okay, so CO2 goes down, super duper. It's also the case that particulate matter goes down. Why do we care about particulate matter going down? Well, because there are health effects thereof. Air pollution is one of the most dangerous things out there in the world. I would argue that instead of framing the kind of shipping of climate policy out to the world as a climate solution, we ought to be thinking about the shipping of climate policy out into the world as a neurological health effort, right? I can't tell you how many times I've written this sentence, neurological health is addressable by climate policy. It's kind of just a funny feature that that's true, right? That we have these tools, right? Among them, things like ensuring coal plants aren't really doing their thing. Among them, ensuring that, maybe there's a tax on carbon, right? There are a variety of levers that one can pull that presumably do something out there related to climate change. Maybe they bring emissions down. I don't really want to think about it too hard. That seems like that's a laudable goal. And in fact, that's the soldier that I'm sneaking in the Trojan horse. But isn't it funny that those policies happen to be the ones that are really, really beneficial for brain health, right? They're the policies that are going to help us ward off the next dementia epidemic. They're the policies that are going to ensure we're not being exposed to neurotoxins in our environment. They're the policies that are going to ensure that the probability of encountering a brain-eating amoeba remains extremely low, right? That's the stuff that I care about. It has a more immediate material effect on my personhood and the community around me. I would argue that the probability of success goes up if we kind of forego the climate conversation a little bit, as politically charged as it's been, and just acknowledge that these are just also the tools. These happen to be the tools that are really, really beneficial for brain health. And I don't know about you, but I'm interested in living a productive, flourishing life. I want my brain to be healthy. I think other people want their brains to be healthy. Turns out that neurological health is addressable by climate policy. And I feel slightly more motivated when I hear that sentence. I feel slightly more, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say hopeful, but in terms of like, do I think this is going to happen? I feel a sense of desire toward a future that I can point to, and I feel more motivated to bringing that future into the present. And I think with more and more senses of that type of desire, the likelihood goes up. I mean, I think the worst mistake that the climate movement has made is rallying around the 2 degrees Celsius number or the 1.5 degrees Celsius number. That means nothing to anyone. Nobody knows the difference between 350 parts per million CO2 and 380 ppm and 420 ppm. You can't stand outside and sniff the difference, right? And yet these numbers and the 2C threshold, right, these are the main communicative tools that policy analysts and climate advocates are using to advocate for the seriousness of the issue. They have absolutely no bearing on our material circumstances. Certainly they do through these secondary vectors. But the fact that we're looking at who knows, 650 parts per million future, it only scares me because of the implications of that number, not the number itself. Of course, this is a raging debate in climate communications. Should we think about the issue itself or the implications thereof? And that's even too reductive of a frame. That's a little bit of a straw man there. But the point holds that I would argue any time that we can get closer to talking about the actual phenomenological experience, the actual material circumstances that affect people's living conditions, that affect people's life, that affect people's well-being, we're doing the movement toward a livable climate future a bit of justice.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Your Brain on Climate with me, Dave. A huge thanks to Clayton Aldern for his book, his time, and his brain. His book, I've said before, I will say it again, is called The Weight of Nature. And if it weren't clear enough, I think you want to read it. If you like this chat, do check out the back catalogue. Plenty of these to go around. You might enjoy the episode with neuroscientist Anil Seth from a few years ago if you like this. It's on some of the same ground. Please do share this episode with a friend and drop me a review on your podcast medium of choice. It really does make a massive difference to a little indie podcaster. And don't forget, if you like what I've done, if you want to chuck in the price of a cup of tea over at patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate, I should be in your debt. Okay, I'll be back soon. And until then, try and keep your head and your nose above water. All right. Bye-bye.